The first thing Maren Voss noticed about the overseer was how clean its hands were. It stood at the far end of the processing floor, if you could call a half-kilometer of polished obsidian a floor, flanked by 2 Kaveth drones with their shock lances already extended. It wore the gold-trimmed black of the Occupation Directorate, which meant it had once served in the field before being elevated to administrative luxury. Its triple-jointed fingers, pale as old bone, were folded behind its back in the posture Directorate handlers called patience, and Maren's work crew called something much less polite. She kept her head down and moved her broom in slow arcs across the floor. 18 months. That was how long she had swept floors for them, hauled their waste, fixed their environmental controls at 3 in the morning when the condensation arrays cracked. 18 months since the dropships came down over what used to be Manitoba, and 18 months since she'd watched Director Cool, this same Cool, the one at the end of the room, order the field burning of the community her father had spent 30 years building. Her father, who had trained under 3 masters before he was 20, who could recite every pressure point in a human body from memory, who had once taken apart 6 armed men in a parking garage and then stopped to help the 7th one up off the ground because the man had tripped over his own feet running away. Her father, who died in the fire because he wouldn't leave without the children from the lower dormitory, and who made it out with 11 of them before the smoke took him 50 meters from the tree line. Maren kept sweeping. Cool moved along the processing line, flanked by its drones, inspecting the day's resource extraction totals on a hovering display. It paused occasionally to tap a notation into the panel with one pale finger. It did not look at the humans. They were not the sort of thing one looked at. This was the first thing the Kaveth got wrong about humanity. They'd spent 300 years watching Earth from quiet distance, cataloging, modeling, running probability matrices on how humans would respond to contact, and they had concluded, with the cold certainty of a species that had never been surprised by anything, that humans were predictable, hierarchical. They would submit to whoever held sufficient force, the same as every other species the Directorate had absorbed. The compliance rate in their models was 94.7%. What the models didn't have was her father's voice in her ear, patient as stone, telling her, "The strongest opponent you will ever face is one who has stopped believing you're a threat." Maren reached the maintenance alcove at the floor's eastern edge. She knelt as if adjusting her equipment. Beneath the false panel she'd loosened 3 weeks ago, wrapped in a length of processing cloth, were the items she'd been collecting since month 4. A length of hydraulic tubing from a cracked condenser line, 2 sharpened alloy rods she'd machined herself during night shifts, a canister of cleaner fluid, highly reactive, a single detonator cap salvaged from a drone that had crashed against the outer wall during a storm and that no one had collected because it wasn't worth a Kaveth's time to retrieve it. She thought about her father. She thought about 11 children making it to the tree line. She thought, what goes around comes around. She stood up with the items concealed against her body under the maintenance coverall and walked toward the processing line. The second thing the Kaveth got wrong about humanity was the concept of a plan. They planned in the Directorate way, layers of protocol, escalating responses, decision trees mapped to every foreseeable contingency. It was comprehensive and it was thoroughly documented, and it had, over 3 centuries, never once accounted for a person who was willing to do something genuinely stupid on purpose. Maren dropped the canister. It hit the obsidian floor with a sharp crack. Cleaner fluid spread in a shimmering pool. Both drones swiveled toward the sound. They were calibrated to threats, and the calibration didn't distinguish between a weapon and a dropped container. Cool turned also, its pale fingers uncrossing from behind its back. And Maren, moving at an angle the drones hadn't registered because she'd already moved before they processed the sound, came in low under the nearest one's shock lance arc. Her father's hands had been wide and calloused and warm. He used to press them against her knuckles when she was getting the angle wrong on a strike, and he'd say, softer than she expected from a man his size, "You're fighting the air. Stop fighting the air. Find the hinge. Everything has a hinge." The drone had a hinge. It was a pivot coupling in the lower chassis, where the torso assembly met the leg struts, a design compromise she'd learned, because Kaveth biology rotated at the hip and their engineers built to their own anatomy. She drove the alloy rod into it at the angle she'd calculated across 3 weeks of watching drones move. The chassis locked. The drone's shock lance fired wide, carving a meter-long scorch across the floor. The second drone adjusted. They learned faster than she'd hoped. She wasn't where she had been. She was already behind Cool. The overseer was fast. They always said the Directorate elite were fast. Faster than their administrative bearing suggested, kept at peak conditioning even through years of bureaucratic comfort. Cool spun with something in its hand, a sidearm she hadn't accounted for. She felt the pulse discharge graze her left shoulder, and the world went white-hot for a half-second. Her father, she remembered, had a scar from a knife across his right forearm that he'd never explained until she was 12. When she finally asked, he'd laughed. Told her, "I got that the same day I learned that being hurt and being stopped are different things." She'd thought he meant it as philosophy. Later, she understood he meant it literally. She didn't stop. The hydraulic tube wasn't a clean weapon. It was a blunt, ungainly piece of equipment, and it required being at extremely close range to matter. She closed the distance inside Cool's guard. Another thing the models got wrong, she suspected. They hadn't anticipated someone trained to close distance rather than maintain it, and brought the tube across the overseer's forearm. The sidearm went wide. The second discharge blew a section of ceiling. The damaged drone had righted itself. She had seconds. She used them to drive Cool back toward the processing line, using what her father had called borrowed ground, the idea that you make the terrain work for you and let your opponent make it work against them. The line had raised edges. Cool's footing was wrong for them. She could see the moment it understood this, the flicker of something in its compound eyes. She thought, "This is the moment you realize I was never sweeping floors." The overseer hit the line edge and stumbled. She followed through. The second drone's shock lance fired and caught her across the back, and she went down on one knee with her vision fragmenting, her entire nervous system screaming, and she stayed on one knee for a full 2 seconds before she got back up. The drone recalibrated. It had been built for opponents who fell and stayed fallen. She detonated the canister. The blast was small, calibrated, she hoped, though hope was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it took out the second drone's targeting array and 3 meters of processing line conduit, half the overhead lighting in the eastern section. In the sudden dark and chaos, she found Cool by the sound of its breathing, which was rapid now and shallow, nothing like its administrative composure. She held the second alloy rod to the base of its skull, where the cervical nerve cluster ran on Kaveth anatomy. She had read everything available in the colony's salvaged databanks about Kaveth physiology. Her father used to say, "Before you walk into a room, know every exit." She had extended that principle. "I want the command codes," she said, "the ones for the labor block containment systems." Cool's breathing slowed by effort. "You will be suppressed within the hour." "Probably," she said. "Codes, you cannot escape this facility." "I know." A silence. She felt it processing this, trying to map her onto its models and finding the shape wrong. A human who had admitted she couldn't escape and was still here, still pressing the rod to its neck, still asking. It had no probability for that. "Why?" it said, and this was the first time she had heard a Kaveth sound uncertain. "What do you expect to achieve?" She thought about 11 children at the tree line. She thought about the 300 people in the labor blocks whose containment fields would drop if she had those codes. She thought about the fact that this facility's emergency protocols would have to focus entirely on an interior security breach, which meant the perimeter watch would pull inward, which meant the eastern fence would be unmanned for somewhere between 11 and 20 minutes. "I'm not trying to escape," she said. "I'm making a door." Cool gave her the codes. She didn't expect to make it out. She had built the plan around not making it out, around the assumption that the door was the point, and the making of it was enough. Her father had built the plan around getting 11 children to the tree line, and had not built it around what happened to him afterward, and she had spent 18 months deciding whether that was failure or completion. She released Cool and moved to the control station and entered the codes. The containment fields in the labor blocks dropped with a low thrum she felt through the floor. She heard, distantly, the beginning of movement, hundreds of people, suddenly free, pouring toward the perimeter. The first suppression drone came through the ceiling access 3 minutes later. She was ready for it. She was not ready for the second or the third. She was ready for the concept of the third, had built it into the math, which is not the same thing as being ready for 3 drones converging on a single small human in a damaged room with no cover and 2 alloy rods and a burned shoulder and a back that had stopped reporting useful information sometime after the shock lance hit. She fought anyway. Her father used to say that fighting was not about winning, that winning was a byproduct of doing the thing correctly for long enough. Do the technique, do it right, do it in the right sequence, and the outcome follows, not always, not inevitably, but more often than you'd think, and especially more often than you'd think when the other side had already decided you were beaten. The drones had decided she was beaten around the 3rd minute. She kept doing the technique. There is a quality in humans that the Kaveth models failed to capture because it doesn't show up in aggregate behavioral data. It shows up in individuals, under specific conditions, and it is this. Some people, when they have already decided what they're willing to pay, become genuinely uncalculable. Not irrational. Irrational implies chaos, something worse than that. Something structured and deliberate and completely unintimidated by cost. The suppression team that reached the processing floor at minute 7 found Director Cool zip-restrained to a conduit, all 3 drones disabled, and 1 human woman bleeding from 4 separate sites, standing, looking at the door they'd come through with the expression of someone who had expected them earlier. She hit the first one with a broken drone component she'd picked up off the floor. At minute 11, the eastern fence section was unmanned. At minute 19, the labor block population had cleared the perimeter. At minute 23, additional Directorate forces arrived to find 2 suppression teams and 3 drones in various states of non-function, 1 Directorate overseer in restraints, and the labor population gone. 412 people, into the forest, scattering in 11 separate directions, because Marin had pressed that instruction into every crew lead she trusted over 18 months of sweeping floors. At minute 26 they found her. She was sitting against the eastern wall, with her back against the cool obsidian, not because she'd chosen it, but because she'd run out of forward. The rod was still in her hand. They had to tell her 3 times to put it down before she believed they weren't Kaveth, before she registered that the uniforms were human. The resistance unit's medic, a young man with the calm eyes of someone who'd seen worse and somehow survived the seeing, knelt next to her and started field dressing the shoulder. "We've been watching this facility for 6 weeks, he said. "We were planning a breach for next month." She looked at him. "You got 400 people out," he said. She thought about 11 children at the tree line. She thought about her father, who had not made it 50 meters. She thought about something he'd told her once, about the difference between the fight you plan for and the fight you get, and how what mattered in the gap between them was not talent or strength or even training, but the thing underneath all of those things. The thing that decided how long you kept doing the technique, when the technique was clearly not going to save you. The medic said, "How did you know they'd pull the perimeter watch inward?" "They're hierarchical," she said. "A breach inside is more important than a breach outside. They think in layers." She paused. "They think in layers, but they don't think in people." He considered this. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the forest, 412 people were moving. She let him finish the dressing, and then she stood up, slowly, in the way of someone taking inventory. "My name is Maren Voss," she said. It seemed like the kind of thing she should say to someone who wasn't Kaveth. It had been a long time since she'd said it to anyone. "I know who you are," the medic said. And from the tone of it, she understood that she'd been wrong about the math, wrong about the acceptable cost, wrong about what the plan was actually for. That somewhere in the gap between minute 1 and minute 26 a different thing had happened than what she'd intended, and it was larger. She picked up one of the intact drone components from the floor. "Habit. What's east of here?" she asked. "Forest," he said, "and then the valley, and then their regional command station." She looked at the component in her hand. "Show me the map," she said. Outside, the eastern fence stood open in the dark. "What goes around," her father used to say, with the calm certainty of a man who had never once stopped believing in the math, "comes around." She walked toward the door.